I have walked the shifting sands of Egypt for longer than memory serves. I have seen empires rise like sandstorms and fall just as quickly. But nothing amuses and saddens me quite like the year 1922. The world stood on the brink of modernity, yet fell easily back into superstition. You know the story, Howard Carter. A candle held to a tiny hole in the ancient stone. He said he saw wonderful things. I was there, standing quietly in the periphery, watching the golden light hit the boy king's face for the first time in 3,000 years. Carter was a man consumed by obsession. For years, he had dug through the blistering heat of the Valley of the Kings, finding nothing but empty rock. But then, a single step was uncovered in the rubble. It led down into the deep, undisturbed dark, the resting place of Pharaoh Tutankhamun. When his trembling hands finally broke the ancient seal, a rush of stale, heavy air escaped into the modern world. It carried the breath of millennia. The newspapers of the time immediately called it a supernatural curse. They spun tales of dark magic, of vengeful spirits guarding the golden treasures. I call it biology. The Valley of the Kings was never meant to be a tourist attraction. It was built as a silent, eternal fortress. When the high priest sealed Tutankhamun's tomb in 1323 BCE, they were not casting dark magic. They were leaving him to the embrace of eternity. They buried the young king with vast amounts of organic matter, slabs of meat, baskets of fruits, fine linens, and intricately carved wooden furniture. These were food and comforts for the afterlife. But over 30 centuries, sealed in absolute darkness with fluctuating humidity, a microscopic ecosystem evolved in that chamber. The modern men who broke that seal did not respect the immense passage of time. They eagerly rushed into a space that had been dead for ages. They inhaled the thick dust of millennia without a second thought. They breathed in an atmosphere that was no longer meant for human lungs. And soon after, the first of them would fall, not struck down by an ancient phantom in the dark, but by something entirely real. Let us speak of the first so-called victim. Lord Carnarvon, the wealthy, aristocratic financier of the entire expedition. Did an ancient phantom strike him down in the dark of the tomb? No. The historical truth is far less poetic and far more human. While staying at the Continental Savoy Hotel in Cairo, Carnarvon was bitten on the cheek by a common desert mosquito. Days later, while shaving, his hand slipped. The straight razor sliced directly into the swollen, irritated bite, opening a gateway for disaster. In the early 1920s, before Alexander Fleming gifted the world with penicillin, a simple bacterial infection was effectively a death sentence. Sepsis set in. He suffered for weeks as the bacteria poisons coursed through his blood, turning into lethal pneumonia. On April 5, 1923, Carnarvon died. At the very exact moment of his passing, the entire city of Cairo was plunged into total darkness by a sudden power failure. A coincidence turned into an omen. But the medical truth didn't sell newspapers. The world was hungry for the supernatural, and the global media was eager to feed them lies. You see, only one paper, the Times of London, had purchased the exclusive rights to the tomb's discoveries. Every other journalist was locked out. Starved for facts, locked out of the valley, they resorted to the oldest trick in the trade. They manufactured a myth. They fabricated a curse. The printing presses of London and New York roared into overdrive, churning out sensationalized headlines that captivated millions overnight. Even Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the brilliant creator of Sherlock Holmes, fell victim to the hysteria, claiming an occult elemental caused the death. The public, recovering from the trauma of the Great War, swallowed the story whole. Hysteria gripped London, New York, and Paris. The media transformed a simple biological tragedy into a masterclass of misinformation. The curse of the pharaohs was officially born. But I do not deal in the fabrications of men. Let us cast aside the newsprint and look at the real, invisible guard inside that tomb. If there was a guardian in the tomb of the boy king, it wore no golden mask, and it carried no spear. To understand the truth, we must understand the environment. For 3,000 years, this chamber was a sealed incubator. The ancient priests filled it with life to sustain the boy king in the afterlife. Meats, fruits, fine linens, and massive amounts of wood. But as the millennia passed, that life decayed. In the absolute dark, with fluctuating humidity, it gave birth to a highly specialized microscopic ecosystem. Modern microbiologists have swabbed the lungs of ancient mummies and tested the stagnant air of these unopened chambers. What did they find? They found a resilient, opportunistic, and deadly fungus known to science as Aspergillus flavus. It thrives entirely on decaying organic matter. And when suddenly disturbed by grave robbers or archaeologists, it releases millions of invisible spores into the air. When a human inhales these ancient spores, they take root in the lungs, causing a severe, sometimes fatal, pulmonary infection called aspergillosis. But here is the crucial medical detail. This fungus is rarely deadly to a healthy adult with a strong immune system. And Lord Carnarvon was anything but healthy. The media completely ignored his medical history. Years before he ever set foot in Egypt, Carnarvon suffered a horrific motor car accident in Germany that nearly killed him. The crash left him permanently weakened. His lungs were severely damaged, and his immune system was practically non-existent. He was medically fragile. When he walked into that suffocating antechamber, breathing heavily in the stifling, unbroken heat, he was the perfect host for an ancient pathogen. Combine those fungal spores with the toxic ammonia gas emitted from centuries of bat guano and the stale, oxygen-deprived air. It was not a magic curse. It was a biological time bomb, waiting patiently in the dark for 3 millennia for a vulnerable pair of lungs. The media twisted reality to feed their legends. But let us dismantle this myth with the sharpest weapon humanity possesses: mathematics. If the boy king truly cursed those who disturbed his eternal slumber, we must look at the prime suspect, the man who orchestrated it, Howard Carter. The very man who actually broke the seal, opened the golden sarcophagus, and physically unwrapped the royal mummy with his own hands. He breathed the exact same air, spent hundreds of hours in the deepest chambers, and handled the most sacred artifacts day after day. By the sensational logic of the newspapers, Howard Carter should have been the very first victim to fall in absolute agony. Instead, Carter lived for another 17 peaceful years after opening the tomb, continuing his detailed archaeological work and lecturing around the civilized world. He eventually died of lymphoma at the ripe age of 64 in 1939. A rather patient and lazy curse, wouldn't you say? But the truth didn't matter. The media began expanding their list of victims, linking anyone remotely connected to the expedition to the Phantom Curse. The London and New York newspapers aggressively attributed random suicides, political assassinations, and entirely unrelated tropical fevers to the vengeance of King Tutankhamun. A man dies in a standard traffic accident in London months later? Clearly, the pharaoh did it. It was a masterclass in mass hysteria. Let us look past the sensational headlines and examine the actual numbers. The cold, hard, statistical facts that the press deliberately ignored. Of the 58 people who were physically present when the tomb and the golden sarcophagus were officially opened to the modern world, only 8 individuals died within a dozen years of the excavation. That is a perfectly normal mortality rate for the era. In fact, the average age of death for those deeply involved in the expedition was over 70 years old. A remarkable lifespan back then. The numbers simply do not lie. The dead cannot defend themselves against our fictions, but mathematics will always reveal the truth. But if the dead did not want vengeance, what was the true purpose of all this? What did they actually want from us? I have sat silently with the ancient high priests as they wrapped the dead. I know the true, profound weight of their rituals. They did not write dark curses into the stone to slaughter the living. To the ancient Egyptians, the greatest tragedy was not physical death. The absolute greatest terror was being forgotten. To be erased from memory was to suffer the second death from which there is no return. Their most sacred belief was beautifully simple. To speak the name of the dead is to make them live again in the afterlife. They carved their names deep into granite and gold so that we, the distant travelers of the future, would read them aloud. They wanted eternal life through our shared memory. They sought a legacy of eternal peace, not a fictional legacy of terror and murder. Think of Tutankhamun. He was a frail boy who died entirely too young, buried in a hurried, cramped tomb meant for someone else. For 3,000 years, he was swallowed entirely by the shifting sands of time. He was, by all accounts, completely and utterly forgotten. But ironically, the very 1920s media sensationalism that spawned the fake curse also achieved his ultimate, desperate goal of eternal life. Because of that absurd media frenzy, his name is spoken in every corner of the earth today. He is known by millions globally. In the end, the boy king achieved the exact immortality his priest prayed for. He truly lives on in the minds of humanity. So the next time you hear a tale of a cursed tomb, look past the shadows of modern fiction. Seek the true science. And remember the oldest truth of the desert. The dead ask only for peace, and that we simply remember their names. I am the desert sage. Until the sands shift again, farewell. But the sands of Egypt do not hold all of humanity's false memories. There are other ancient ghosts that have been distorted by the passage of time. Come with me eastward, across the harsh deserts, to the fertile crescent between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, to the great city of Babylon. For millennia, Western texts and biblical stories have painted Babylon as a city of absolute sin, arrogance, and divine punishment. You have heard the legend of the Tower of Babel, a monstrous monument built by arrogant men trying to reach heaven, struck down by an angry god. It is a dramatic story, but like the phantom curse of Egypt, it is a complete fabrication written by Babylon's political enemies. Babylon was not a city of sin. It was the absolute intellectual and scientific center of the ancient world, a hub of astronomy, mathematics, and law. And that legendary tower? It was absolutely real. It was called the Etemenanki, translating to the foundation of heaven and earth. It wasn't built in an arrogant attempt to physically climb into God's domain. It was an advanced astronomical observatory. The Babylonians built it high to escape the distortion of the desert heat waves, allowing them to map the movements of the planets with terrifying precision. They invented the 360-degree circle, the 60-minute hour, and tracked the orbit of Jupiter centuries before Europe even existed as a concept. The tower wasn't a symbol of human arrogance. It was a bridge of knowledge between humanity and the cosmos. So, if it wasn't destroyed by a wrathful god for their arrogance, where did the myth of the confusion of tongues come from? It came from a very simple reality. Babylon was the New York City of the ancient world. It was a massive, unprecedented multicultural hub. To a rural, nomadic outsider from the desert arriving at its gates, walking into a city where hundreds of thousands of people spoke dozens of foreign languages, it would sound exactly like a divine curse. It would sound like a devastating confusion of tongues, but it was merely globalization. So if God did not strike down the magnificent tower with a bolt of lightning, how did it disappear from the earth? The truth is far more tragic. The tower was not destroyed by sudden wrath. It was slowly murdered by time, neglect, and changing empires. In the year 331 BCE, a young conqueror marched into the ancient city, Alexander the Great of Macedonia. When he looked upon the Etemenanki ziggurat, it was already ancient and crumbling. But Alexander was a man of supreme ambition. He wanted to restore Babylon to its former glory. He ordered his vast army of soldiers to completely clear the debris to rebuild it from scratch. For months, they tore down the protective outer layer of baked bricks, exposing the fragile, unbaked mud core of the giant structure. But fate had a different plan. Before the reconstruction could even begin, Alexander fell violently ill. He died in Babylon at the age of 32. With his death, his massive empire immediately fractured. The army abandoned the project. The giant, stripped core of the tower was left completely exposed. Without its protective shell, the structure was doomed. Over the next few centuries, local populations arrived to scavenge the ruins. The high-quality baked bricks were too valuable to ignore. They were stolen to build houses, walls, and entirely new cities in the region. And what of the exposed inner core? Unbaked mud brick is nothing more than dry dirt. When the winter rains came, it simply melted. The foundation of heaven and earth turned back into the very mud it was born from, washing away into the Euphrates. The great Tower of Babel did not fall from divine wrath. It fell from human abandonment. It was dismantled by kings and erased by the weather. The biblical writers, seeing only this melted, pathetic mound of mud centuries later, assumed it must have been destroyed by a furious god. That is the true tragedy of Babel. It wasn't the loss of a single language. It was the loss of incredible science, buried alive underneath a myth, mud and dirt. It is the beginning and the end of all things in Mesopotamia. But the earth here holds a much darker, older memory. History books call this region the Fertile Crescent. They paint an image of an earthly paradise, a lush Garden of Eden bursting with effortless life. That is a romantic delusion. The truth? Mesopotamia was a brutally harsh, unforgiving wasteland. It rarely rained. The summer heat was lethal. Without human intervention, nothing but the hardiest weeds could survive here. The great Sumerian civilization rose because they performed a miracle of engineering. They dug massive irrigation canals by hand, forcing the rivers to water the desert. For centuries, this ingenuity worked brilliantly. The desert bloomed. Cities grew. They conquered nature. But nature is a patient adversary. Hidden inside that life-giving river water was a microscopic, silent killer. Salt. Every drop of river water carried tiny amounts of dissolved salt. When the scorching sun evaporated the water, the salt remained in the soil. Year after year, decade after decade, the salt accumulated. The brilliant Sumerians had essentially poisoned their own land through over-irrigation. The earth turned white, the crops mutated, weakened, and finally refused to grow. The foundation of their entire empire was dead. They tried switching from wheat to barley, which is more salt-tolerant. But eventually, even the barley choked and died in the toxic earth. Without food, the cities starved. The great Sumerian civilization wasn't suddenly conquered by superior weapons from foreign invaders. They collapsed from within. Mass starvation forced an unprecedented exodus. They abandoned the very cities they had built, fleeing northward to survive. The Akkadians and later empires simply walked into a dying region and assimilated whoever was left. Sumer was erased by its own success. A civilization that conquers nature without understanding its limits is merely building its own magnificent tomb. I have walked through the tombs of Egypt, the grand observatories of Babylon, and the dead, salted fields of Sumer, three foundational pillars of human civilization. Three magnificent attempts by mankind to touch eternity. Yet, history has distorted their true memories. We replace their profound realities with cheap curses, biblical myths, and romanticized paradises. The Egyptians did not want to kill the living. They merely wanted us to speak their names, so they would not suffer the second death. The Babylonians did not build their tower out of sinful arrogance to challenge God. They built an observatory to map the mechanics of the cosmos. And the Sumerians did not fall to foreign swords. They fell because their brilliant mastery over nature blinded them to nature's ultimate revenge. Three different cultures, three distinct paths, but they all share one undeniable, terrifying truth that we, in the modern world, desperately try to ignore. Everything we build, everything we conquer, eventually returns to the dust. The earth always reclaims its loans. That is why the role of the historian is not just to recite dates and battles. Our duty is to rescue the dead from the prison of modern myths. When we strip away the sensational headlines and the fictional curses, we don't find monsters. We find human beings, exactly like us. They shared our exact same fears, the fear of disease, the fear of famine, the terror of being forgotten by the future. Look at our modern world. Are we not building our own towers of Babel? Are we not draining our own rivers, insulting our own earth? And are we not entirely controlled by our own modern scribes? The media that will still invent a curse tomorrow just to sell a headline? The ruins of the past are not just tourist attractions or ghost stories. They are mirrors. And if we refuse to look closely, we will be the next ghosts buried in the sand. But there is one final secret they left behind to save us. They knew that gold could be stolen. They knew that stone would eventually crumble into dust. So they created something far more resilient than empires. They created the immortal vessel of human thought. They invented writing. They trapped their voices in clay and painted their memories onto papyrus. They realized that while flesh decays and cities drown in salt, an idea, a story, is entirely bulletproof. If a story is passed down, the soul of a civilization survives. That is the true magic they left behind. That is why I wander these shifting sands. I do not merely tell history, I am the keeper of their scattered, forgotten memories. But a memory dies if there is no one left to listen. That is why you are here, traveler, to hear the true echoes of the past. If you seek the truth buried beneath the sand, if you wish to guard the lost knowledge of our ancestors, then join me. Subscribe to the journey. For as long as there are those willing to listen, the ancient world will never truly die. I am the desert sage. Until the sands shift again, keep their memories alive.